In any discussion about abortion, the first question that should be answered is, when does life begin? Everyone has a moment in time when the fetus transforms from what we consider not a life to what we consider a life. And by the term fetus, I refer to the unborn human being. Most pro-lifers believe that life begins at conception, whereas most pro-choicers believe that life begins around 24 weeks gestation, either as the moment of viability or as the moment the fetus first gains conscious awareness. Other milestones people generally consider are 6 weeks at the first heartbeat or 12 weeks with brain activity. Each belief has its own reasoning, and there's always some truth to it. For example, people believe that life begins at the first heartbeat because life ends when our heartbeat stops. When our heartbeat stops, we're dead. And so the opposite must be true. When our heartbeat first starts, we're alive. So life begins at the first heartbeat. The problem with this reasoning is that 1, your heart can stop beating, but you can come out of it alive. You can be temporarily clinically dead and still be alive afterwards. In this case, you don't concede your right to life just because your heartbeat stops. And 2, even before the first heartbeat, the fetus can be considered biologically alive at conception. And so the heartbeat is an arbitrary signifier for the beginning of life. The idea that life begins at our first heartbeat has some truth to it, in that we're alive when our hearts are beating, but it's flawed to think that we necessarily lose our right to life when our heart stops beating. And what about brain activity at 12 weeks? Is the first signs of brain activity the beginning of life? Well, in the case of a brain-dead person in a permanent vegetative state, they have lost their right to life because euthanasia at this point is permissible. That means that if life ends at brain death, then life must start at brain life. I think a lot of people agree with this statement, so brain activity is a plausible moment for when life begins. Now let's take fetal viability. This is the moment in time when the fetus can live outside of the mother's womb. Roe v. Wade set the precedent that states can't prohibit abortion until this time, and many pro-choicers tend to agree that life does begin at viability. Though it doesn't make sense, because life doesn't end when we become unviable, quote unquote. We could still have the right to life, but not be viable, such as in the case of someone who requires medical equipment to survive. They deserve the right to life as much as a perfectly healthy human being. But the fetus is in a similar situation where they're unable to support themselves, but pro-choicers will still conclude that they don't have the right to life. Well, it's totally contradictory, so it has to be rejected. I will say that fetal viability is important to an extent, because at this point, the fetus can survive on its own. It doesn't need to use the mother's body, and so abortion unnecessarily kills the fetus. Still, this doesn't have anything to do with the nature of human life, because there's not a difference between an unviable fetus and a viable fetus, the same as an unviable person and a viable person. The most common pro-choice argument is that 24 weeks gestation is the first moment the fetus is consciously aware. It can begin to have human experiences, no matter how rudimentary those experiences may be. This is the personhood argument. Life ends when you cease to have experiences, and so the opposite must be true. Life begins when you begin having experiences. I think this falls in line with the brain activity argument because both agree that life begins and ends when your ability to experience things begins and ends. For brain activity, people consider the first electrical pulses the first sign of life. But conscious awareness is more of a philosophical approach, which doesn't have an exact measurement. Still, both rely on the idea that life begins when your mind begins. And so they rely on the psychological criterion of life. You are not your body, but your mind. A fetus before 24 weeks gestation is your body, but it's not your life yet. Your life only begins when your brain develops enough to have experiences. I think this is a pretty popular idea to associate your life with your mind. And so the beginning of your mind is a plausible moment for the beginning of life. Finally, we make our way back to conception, the most common pro-life argument. When sperm meets ova and creates the zygote is when life begins. Pro-lifers assert that a new human being is created with unique DNA. This rejects the psychological criterion of life. You are not your mind, but your body. But if life begins when your body is formed, does it end when your body is unformed? Because technically, your decomposing corpse isn't completely unformed yet. Your body can still be intact after your mind dies. But at that point, no one really considers you a life anymore. So since life doesn't end when the body is fully decomposed, why should life begin when it's first composed at conception? The decomposing body argument presents a strong counter to conception as the beginning of life. However, I believe that the way we've been thinking about conception has been wrong. Conception isn't just the first moment that your body is formed. It's also the first moment that your nature is first determined. Conception is the first moment that we're able to develop and grow into a fully realized human being. And when I say develop and grow, I mean both developing the mind and developing the body. I think it's in our nature to develop and grow our mind and our body. And when we can't do that anymore, and we cease having experiences when our mind dies or our body dies, we're dead. And so the opposite must be true. The first moment where we're able to develop and grow is when life begins. And that moment is conception. And that's why I believe that conception is a plausible marker for the beginning of life. Both conception and personhood have pretty good arguments for being the beginning of life. And I think there's some agreement between both pro-choice and pro-lifers here. Both believe that there's definitely not a life before 0 weeks gestation at conception, and they both believe that there's definitely a life after 24 weeks gestation. And this leaves us with a disagreement about the fetus's life between 0 and 24 weeks gestation, the first and second trimesters where the vast majority of abortions occur. So, to back up their claim that life begins at conception, pro-lifers make an appeal to human rights. To believe in human rights means that you must believe that humans are inherently valuable and their rights must be respected regardless of certain statuses like race, sex, and age. Since the fetus can be considered a very young human being, and since we can't discriminate against age, then the fetus deserves human rights. And so life and the right to life begins at conception. It seems like a pretty rock-solid argument. But pro-choicers may argue that despite being biologically alive, the fetus still can't experience harm, and therefore can't be harmed until 24 weeks. How can it be wrong to harm something that can't experience pain or experience anything at all? A fetus has no thoughts or feelings or desire their own life. So this must mean that death doesn't harm the fetus. This is the personhood argument. In philosophy, there's a separation between people and person. Informally, we use the two terms interchangeably to refer to individuals. But person is a technical term in philosophy. It can be defined as a state of being based on the following criteria: sentience, conscious awareness, self-motivated action, the ability to communicate, and rationality. A person doesn't need to fulfill all the criteria in order to be considered a person, nor is it the case that exhibiting just one of them will mean that they're a person. It's controversial to say the least, so I could probably make an entirely different video about it, but for the sake of this video, this is enough. So pro-choicers claim that before personhood, the fetus can't be harmed, because only persons have the mental faculties to experience pain and the awareness that they're being harmed. How can a fetus be harmed if they have no ability to feel harm? Victims have to be persons in order to experience harm. Therefore, anytime before 24 weeks gestation, we are morally allowed to do anything we want to the fetus. In other words, death isn't a harm to the fetus because nothing is a harm to the fetus. And this is why abortion is permissible. The fetus can't be harmed by death because it can't experience death. But we ourselves don't experience death. The clearest example of this would be if you died painlessly in your sleep. You died while you were unconscious, so you didn't feel any physical pain. Therefore, it can be said that, much like the fetus, that you didn't experience death, and so death wasn't a harm for you. I'd even go so far to say that a painful death isn't a harm from death. The cause of death might cause you pain while you're alive, but it's not harm you get from death itself. Well, this is the experiential criteria of harm, and this asserts that death itself is not actually harmful, only the pain you get while living. And this is actually the Greek philosopher Epicurus' argument about the nature of death. It's that death has no subject of harm. The living can't experience death while they're alive, nor for the dead, because they no longer exist. The pro-choice premise that the fetus can't be harmed by death because it doesn't experience death also applies to every one of us. And if we can't be harmed by death, then there's nothing at all wrong with killing others, because no one is harmed by it. That's why we have to reject the experiential criteria of harm in order to reject the no subject of harm claim. Physical harm can't be the only way that we can be harmed. So instead, pro-choicers will argue that persons have developed interests that fetuses don't have. And so premature death for a person deprives them of achieving those interests, whereas fetuses have no interest to be deprived of. And so this is the interest criteria of harm. Personhood then is only relevant to human life because only persons can have an interest in life, and not just because we can experience harm. However, I don't think this is necessarily true. I think this pro-choice argument only covers the self-interest criteria of harm, and a fetus can have an interest in life without having a self-interest. To illustrate this point, take the case that a proper education may be beneficial for a child who hates school. The child's interest in receiving an education is directly opposed to his self-interest in hating education. Receiving a proper education is in the kid's interest, but it's not in his self-interest, like how a right to life is in the fetus's best interest, despite having no self-interest. But the more important point that I want to make with this is that having these beneficial interests doesn't require you to be a person, and so fetuses before 24 weeks can have these interests. Now, to prove this point, take the case of the child who hates school again. The child doesn't desire what's in his best interest. We can determine that 1, desiring an interest is not a criteria for having interests. Now, consider the case that you die painlessly in your sleep again. We can agree that your premature death here is bad, even though you didn't experience any physical pain. You had an interest in life while you were unconscious. So we can determine that 2, consciousness isn't a criteria for having interests. Now consider that you're awake. You might ultimately desire to be, say, the world's greatest musician. But at this point, all you can think about is eating breakfast. You may have an interest in becoming the greatest musician, but at this point in time, you're not constantly aware of it. So we can determine that 3, being constantly aware of your interests is not a criteria for having interests. So, if I don't have to desire an interest to have an interest, nor be conscious to have an interest, nor be presently thinking about an interest to have an interest, then there's really nothing about personhood that's required of me to have an interest. There are things in a fetus's best interest even before it's a person, and these aren't self-interests. An interest in life is not exclusive to persons. And so premature death for a fetus is bad for it because it doesn't get to achieve its interest in life. And this is the exact same reason that death is bad for us, is that we don't get to achieve our interest in life as well. I think the interest criteria of harm shows exactly why the fetus is alive and why its premature death is bad, is that when one dies, they're deprived of their interest in living. They're deprived of their future. And in the words of the philosopher Don Marquis, they're deprived of a future like ours. And that means that death itself is harmful. And so this is the only way to reject Epicurus' no subject of harm claim, is that if we treat our futures as valuable, our potential as valuable. And although our futures are only potential, I think our potential is actually what gives us as human beings inherent value. Potential to live a good life and do good in life is inherent in all of us until we die and there's no more potential. You, me, and all the fetuses have potential worth valuing. And premature death is harmful because it prevents us from achieving this potential. There is a slight flaw in this idea though. It's that if potentiality is what makes death harmful, then shouldn't the death of a fetus be worse than the death of an adult human being, because the fetus had more potential goods to lose in life. That would mean that the younger someone is, the more tragic their premature death would be. So the death of a zygote then must be more tragic than the death of a newborn baby, and the death of a newborn baby must be more tragic than the death of an adult person, and etc. and etc. We'll call this the whole lifetime perspective, because it only takes into account the span of someone's whole lifetime. This means that death at the beginning of life is the most tragic, because considering someone's whole lifetime, this would be the moment where they've lost the most potential goods. However, intuitively, I think this is wrong. The death of a zygote is actually not as tragic as the death of a newborn human being. I think even pro-lifers can concede that the death of a third trimester fetus is much worse than a first trimester fetus, but the whole lifetime perspective can't rationalize it. This is where self-interest make a comeback. Someone's self-interest at the time of their death matters in determining the amount of harm done to them. This is called the desire satisfaction account. The adult person has self-interest in their family, their career, friends, etc., whereas fetuses can't have that. An argument can be made that this adult person's death is more tragic than a fetus's, since the adult had more self-interest deprived from them than the fetus. Simply put, the adult has more to lose. The desire satisfaction account means that the older you get, the more self-interest you accrue, and so death is more harmful the older you get. The desire satisfaction account is correct in personhood's effect on the harm of death, but wrong if used to assume that just because the fetus isn't a person, that death isn't harmful to them. Whereas the whole lifetime perspective does just the opposite. The whole lifetime perspective is correct in potentiality's effect on the harm of death, but wrong if used to assume that a person's death is less harmful than a fetus's. So why not just combine the two and say that the impact of one's death changes relative to the time of their death? This takes into account both the developed interest they may have had, as well as the potential goods they were deprived of. In other words, this takes into account both potentiality and personhood. And this is called time relative interest. And I think this follows exactly how we think about death already. The fetus may not have self-interest, but since it's missing out on potential goods throughout its life, its premature death is still tragic. The newborn baby has less potential goods, but more experiences, meaning a stronger self-interest in life, making the newborn's premature death more tragic than the fetus's. The adult person has less potential goods than the newborn, but it has a much stronger self-interest in life, making the adult's premature death actually more tragic than the newborn and the fetus's. And an old man has the least potential goods, as well as less self-interest than the adult, since presumably they've achieved a lot of their self-interest through their life, making their death less tragic than the adult person's. These analyses take into account both the developed self-interest as well as the potential goods deprived. And this is why I think time relative interest is the best way to measure the impact of one's death. Going back to the question of when does life begin, I believe I've made a sufficient case that life begins at conception. Personhood as the beginning of life simply can't refute Epicurus's no subject of harm claim, and so it's got to be rejected. Potentiality matters, and so the zygote must matter. Still, there's a problem with what exactly is encompassed under potentiality. Pro-choicers can still assert that sperm in ova should be just as valued as a fetus. All the sperm and ova that didn't make it, plus all the combinations of potential persons from each sperm and ova must have some moral value. In other words, this is the masturbation is murder argument. I said before that intuitively, there is an agreement that there's no life before 0 weeks. But when faced with this argument, it seems that potentiality must include potential before conception. However, I think this can be resolved by appealing to nature. Remember, the natural function of the zygote is to develop and grow and be a human being, whereas the natural function of the sperm and ova is to conceive a zygote. The function of the separated sperm and ova is not to grow and develop as a human being. It's only until they're together that they become the zygote, which does have that. And so the right to life is only given to organisms whose natural function it is to live a life like ours. And by adding this criteria to potentiality, This becomes the strongest argument made for fetal right to life made so far. Still, there's a lot of controversy with potentiality. One of the most common pro-choice rebuttals is that potential persons shouldn't have the rights of persons. We don't give potential presidents the rights to the presidency, nor do we treat an acorn like an oak tree. It's to say that fetuses shouldn't have the rights to life because only persons have the right to life. Well, I think this falls right back into the personhood pit because, fetuses can't have the right because they can't be harmed. But if you say that, that goes back into the experiential criteria of harm, which can't reject the Epicurus is no subject of harm claim. And so it goes right back around into the interest criteria of harm and potentiality. Also, this can be refuted by the human rights argument again. Although fetuses aren't persons, they are human beings, and all human beings are accorded human rights. So this pro-choice rebuttal really has no ground. Another common pro-choice argument, not necessarily against potentiality, but against pro-lifers in general, is the death penalty argument. It's in the name pro-life that they value life. And if life is so valuable to them, then shouldn't the death penalty be immoral in their view? Well, potentiality actually shows why someone can be pro-life and believe in the death penalty and be morally consistent. Even though everyone has potential goods in life, there are certain contexts where it's clear that there are no more potential goods. Take the case of a brain-dead patient in a vegetative state. Euthanasia is permissible. This may also apply to terminal patients told that the rest of their lives will be in excruciating pain. When there's no more potential future of value, then death is not a harm. The harm of living reasonably outweighs any potential goods these people may have had. This shows that it's possible to prove that someone has no more potential future of value. And in the case of the death penalty, certain criminals have shown that they have no more potential for good. Their actions are so despicable and character devoid of remorse that it would warrant ending their lives via state-enforced execution. But most criminals are not at that level, meaning that they still have potential futures of value. And for these people, we choose lesser forms of punishment like imprisonment and rehabilitation with the hope that they'll come out as well-adjusted members of society. Now, this is definitely a different issue than abortion, but I think the idea behind potentiality is consistent. We can prove our potentials, at least for people who believe in euthanasia and the death penalty, this is true. However, I think it's only possible to prove your potential if you have a lot of conscious experiences. People with little conscious experiences or no conscious experiences at all, like fetuses or newborn babies, it's impossible for them to prove their own potential through their own actions. There are still cases that the fetus has no potential though, but not because it was proven through their own actions. Say in the case of an ectopic pregnancy, when the fetus is growing outside of the womb, and there's no chance that the fetus will live, plus there's substantial harm done to the mother, then it's permissible to end the fetus's life, because it has no potential anymore. So killing the fetus here is morally permissible. The most common pro-choice rebuttals can be disproven using potentiality. And for those who still reject potentiality, I think there's a darker idea behind that belief. Think of the question, is it better not to exist or to live and suffer? Single-parent households, finances, culture, these are just some factors that can determine how someone's life may turn out. And for kids who grow up in the worst of circumstances, is it not better for them to not exist than to live and suffer? The potential suffering outweighs any potential goods this kid may have had. And so this begs the question, how much foreseeable suffering exactly would make not existing permissible? We already know why women choose to abort. According to the Turnaway study, we have finances and bodily harms of childbirth, not being able to support the fetus. Simply put, the future looks hopeless. And so it shouldn't be wrong to kill the fetus before it lives and suffers. But I don't believe that statistics, anecdotes, and research can exactly predict how someone's life may turn out. There are people that come from the worst of circumstances as great people, and others who come from the most fortunate of circumstances as terrible people. Is it even possible for us to know how someone's life may turn out just based off of the circumstances they were born into? Remember, foreseeable suffering is only a prediction. So, is it right for us to decide who gets to live and who gets to not live based off of our own predictions. Some doctors perform abortions due to genetic abnormalities, such as Down syndrome and cleft palates, but refuse to perform abortions based on sex or race. This is a widely accepted form of eugenics, which is contradictory to the rationale behind it. That rationale being that a valid argument for abortion can be made against any amount of suffering. This is a policy that allows abortions for any reason whatsoever, commonly known as abortion on demand. Based on this policy, doctors should be required to perform abortions no matter the reason. There shouldn't be a difference whether it was due to genetic abnormality nor sex-race discrimination, because the fetus can suffer in life due to their sex and race, like how they can suffer if they have a genetic abnormality. Every reason to abort becomes a valid reason. But I don't even think that pro-choicers can concede that every reason is a good reason to abort a fetus. Therefore, it's unacceptable to believe that not existing is better than living in suffering, because it will lead to these policies that have unacceptable consequences, like validating every reason as a good reason to abort. The only reasons that are acceptable to abort for pro-lifers is if the life of the fetus threatens the life of the mother. And although this has unacceptable consequences for pro-choicers, I think the rationale is actually pretty solid. Since we can't predict the future, it's immoral to kill the fetus who may have much more potential goods than we can foresee. And it's not even enough to say that the fetus will suffer in the future, because the thing is, everyone suffers in life. It's simply the human condition, and there's only ever been one thing we can do about it. It's how we respond. The psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl's equation puts it best. D equals S minus M. Despair is suffering devoid of meaning. As humans, we can find meaning in the worst of situations, and it will make life worth living. Suffering in life is a given. How we choose to respond defines who we are. Life does indeed begin at conception, and so it would make sense to lean pro-life and support abortion restrictions. However, it's not just the life of the fetus at stake. We have to consider both the life of the fetus and the life of the mother. This is why pro-choicers can concede that life begins at conception, but still find that the rights of the mother is stronger than the fetus's right to life. Does the fetus even have a right to the mother's body? And considering time-relative interests, it's totally plausible that, say, a first trimester fetus's interest in life is much weaker than the woman's right to her own body. But these are questions I'll cover in the next video. Thanks for watching.